because right, like Kant is in this time where he's like contending metaphysically with the fact that Newton has just like broken the world. He's like, oh, I've discovered gravity. I'm like figuring out how light works, and everyone's mind is kind of blown. But in the same way, you can think of permanence as in like water, right? Like water has three states. It has, you know, it can be a vapor, it can be a liquid, it can be ice, it can be a solid, and we recognize it all as water, you
Yes.
know. And so this is what he's referring to, basically, is that we have this mode of intuition that we can recognize that even though something's state is changing, that it itself is not fundamentally. And we can, and this is of course very important for cause and effect, right? That we can see the through line when something does undergo a change, that you know its origin and where it ends up is still the same object, and so you can start making claims of cause and effect.
Yeah, and really, what's interesting is that he is, despite the fact that something like Newtonian physics is being born, right? Um, we, at the same time, we see him producing a entirely new description of cause and effect. Because, ostensibly, the scientific form of cause and effect is delineating a single object and how it relates to another object, how that force expresses itself on the next object. Famously, in Hume, who is one of his greatest objects of critique, there is the billiard ball example.
Yeah.
And there is isolating all of these objects, right? But instead, he is.
And Hume, I should say, empiricist. He's not really sure that anything is real.
Yeah, yeah. He's willing to question all of the things that he knows until they do not like follow his empirical values, or rather the opposite. Everything that he knows empirically he will trust, but he leaves it open that it could all possibly change. Like the sun could not rise one day, and if it did, then his empirical beliefs would have to then change as well.
Totally. And Kant is agreeing with him in some ways. I mean, what's the dude's name? Something Wolf wrote a whole book about it where he basically comes by some writings of Hume in a German translation before writing this book, and he kind of has to give it to Hume. He's like, well, you know, he's right. Kant obviously believes in cause and effect and wants to be able to prove it somehow, but he will concede that by empirical thought alone, yeah, it seems like the sun's going to rise every day, but you know, scientifically we know now that like that's not going to be true all the time.
Yeah.
And so like in what way can we be confident about any cause and effect?
And then that's what's so fascinating about what he does, is because he takes it away from exactly that. By setting up the transcendental, that the standard is not the external world, that cause and effect is out there in the real world, while we have this mind that is experiencing potentially illusory things, right? And setting up a standard of the transcendental, he's able to say that the cause and effect relationship isn't between the billiard ball and the billiard ball, though it can be elaborated in that way as we conceptualize it. But it is more basically just an A-B relationship between what we're sensing and what we just sensed.
Right.
And, or what we're sensing and what is beside it, right? And he comes up with all these new concepts and this new sensibility of what cause and effect means. It isn't a relationship of like individual objects isolated out of the world, but it's rather the whole world in series, all of experience at least in series, and how it relates to each other and how we can draw complexities and relationships from that.
Yeah, and I think where he really breaks the mold is in his third analogy of experience, which is he calls simultaneity or community. And I think what's really novel here, and I think it really, jumps off of the billiard ball example really well, is that things have a relation of influence. So it's not just you strike the cue ball. There's a cause and effect there. It hits the balls,
Exactly.
and it can all be mapped out mathematically, but that in every action, in every object, that everything is interacting with each other simultaneously.
Yes.
And so you could think about that as, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. But in Kant takes it even farther than that. And he has this wonderful phrase that I really love. He calls it matter's reciprocal influence. So that there is this community that it's existing where and complicates cause and effect. It's not just there is a cause that leads to effect. So A creates something in B, but simultaneously B is also causing something in A.
Yes. He gives a very simple example. He says, you can go into a room and you can feel the heat, and then you can look over and see the furnace. But the effect, the heat, and the cause are coexisting, right? And that heat, who knows? It could be causing some reaction, and it could itself be a cause, right? So all of a sudden, if it's not just serial, as the scientific imagination would have it, force A acts on object B, which creates force B, which acts on object C. Instead, you have all of these coexisting and layering objects that are all, the only way that we can perceive them is through this internal sense, time.
Right.
And so this is really kind of the image that he's trying to draw.
Ooh.
Everything is translated inside of us, as you said, in reproduction, and then through time, through that temporality, we're able to demarcate all of these different relationships that were heretofore impossible, right? That required this just innate sensibility.
Yeah, and like when we started this, I never thought in a million years that this like conservative kind of socially frustrated old man Immanuel Kant would excite me the way that he does in these kinds of passages, because what he's doing here, I think, is responding to sort of the Newtonian physics of the day, but in that time the sort of worldview was this mechanistic worldview that in some ways, we were talking about this earlier in the car, that there was this idea that maybe God was a clockmaker. And he built this clock and wound it up, but now it's just running. And that you can sort of develop these Newtonian ideas of physics because it's essentially just reverse engineering a machine.
And one day, when the math gets good enough, we would be able to predict into the future everything that would happen.
And see God. Right?
Yes. And that was the Leibnizian idea.
Right. But Kant is saying he is sort of prefiguring what is to come, which at this sort of mechanism gets frustrated by the organicism of Darwin and these ideas of evolution, and that things don't change so predictably serially. And he's doing this by, basically complicating the cause and effect relationship and saying, well, no, everything is interacting all of the time.
Yeah.
It's not a simple A to B. It's on one hand, everything in this room is interacting with me, and I am interacting with everything in the room.
Yes.
He has this kind of interesting thing where he I'm just going to paraphrase rather than reading a dense quote, but where he says that, the light bit playing between our eyes and the celestial bodies can bring about an indirect community between us and them, and can thereby prove their simultaneity. And, so we obviously know with light speed and stuff that maybe the star isn't simultaneous with our existence, but that light is existing at the same time as we are.
Yes.
And if we can see it, then it's interacting with us, just as anyone who can see us, we are interacting with them.
But this actually, what you just brought up, brings up one of the greatest complications of and problematics of what he's talking about.
Which we should problematize Kant, because he's not a saint or anything,
No,
we don't critique necessarily, but we do and should, right?
Yeah. We're not in this to tell you if Kant is good or bad.
Right. Or tell you if he's right or wrong.
Right or
who
wrong.
knows?
Yes. But we can bring up these kind of questions about it. And there's two ways in which this goes, and we can talk about Newtonian physics, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, what you brought up, the star is causing well beyond the existence of human being, right? And we are still perceiving it, right? But it also works the opposite way, that we can work with a system of mathematics, right? And we can predict the behavior of that star way out there without ever actually seeing its function. And we can create a scientific axiom. And within his system, because everything has to be based on what is empirically verifiable, and then it is available for our conceptual understanding, it's questionable if it allows for the causal effect of something that is non-existent. That star, he would say, oh, it is just the light, but it also was a star well before there was any consciousness to perceive it, right? And does he account for the reality of something before there was any human consciousness at all? And I'm just leaving that as a point because we will get that later with a
right.
different
And I was
concept.
going to say, you're actually like approaching, I think, to Kant what this is all really about.
Yeah.
And because he's trying to set the stage and really plant his flag in something that he can, in a place that he can make statements from, that he can have confidence in that they have truth.